If you're trying to figure out what's happening in Vancouver real estate right now, here's the problem. There isn't one Vancouver housing market. Detached homes are behaving differently from townhouses. Townhouses are behaving differently from condos. And what's happening in Kitsilano can be completely different than what's happening just a few kilometers away in Fairview, Mount Pleasant, or downtown. So today, we're going to break down exactly what's happening with detached homes, townhouses, and condos. And then I'm going to take you inside 4 Vancouver neighborhoods to show you where buyers have leverage and where sellers still have the advantage. And there's one statistic I want you to pay particular attention to. It's called the sales to active ratio. And right now, we can go from roughly 7% in one Vancouver market to 37% in another. That's the difference between buyers having significant negotiating power and sellers potentially having the upper hand. And this matters because relying on a headline saying Vancouver is a buyer's market could actually cost you money. A buyer could walk into a competitive property expecting a huge discount that simply isn't realistic. Or a seller could price aggressively because they heard sales are improving while competing against dozens of home buyers to choose from. Both mistakes come from looking at Vancouver as one market. I'm Mike Dirks with Vancouver Family Living. I live here in Kitsilano with my family, and I've been helping people buy and sell real estate across Vancouver for more than a decade. The purpose of this channel is to get past the headlines and give families practical information they can actually use when making real estate decisions in Vancouver. First, let's establish what's happening overall. The latest official Greater Vancouver data shows Metro Vancouver's composite benchmark price at roughly 1.1 million. That's about 6% below last year. But here's what's interesting. Sales have been improving while inventory remains unusually high. There were more than 17,000 properties available, roughly 30% above the 10-year seasonal average. So buyers are participating in the market, but there's still enough inventory that they're generally not being forced to chase everything that comes up. That's why I don't think crash describes this market particularly well. It's better described as a slower, extremely price-sensitive market. And now let's separate it by property type. Detached houses are where we're seeing some of the clearest buyer leverage. On Vancouver's west side in July, there were 669 detached houses available and only 67 sales. That's a 10% sales ratio, buyer's market territory. The median sale price was approximately 2.9 million. Properties were selling around 3% below asking, and average days on market jumped from 19 days in June to 29 days in July. East Vancouver tells a remarkably similar story. There were 644 detached houses available and 66 sales, also a 10% sales ratio. Those homes were selling around 2% below asking, while sales dropped 31% from June. So if you're shopping for a detached home, broadly speaking, buyers have leverage. But we're about to see a major exception to that rule. Townhouses are a different story. The latest official Metro Vancouver benchmark for a townhouse is approximately 1.046 million, about 5% lower than a year earlier. That price decline matters, but townhouses aren't experiencing the same conditions as detached homes. They occupy an interesting middle ground in Vancouver. For families who need to buy 2 or 3 bedrooms but can't make the jump to a detached house, townhouses remain one of the relatively scarce ground-oriented alternatives. So in that scarcity can create competition for the right property, even while the broader market is soft. So this is not a category where I would assume that every seller is going to accept a major discount. Then, of course, we have condos. The latest Metro Vancouver apartment benchmark is roughly 695,000, approximately 7% below last year. But condos are probably the category where you have to be most careful with broad statistics. A 1-bedroom condo downtown, a 2-bedroom family condo in Kitsilano, a newer Mount Pleasant condo are technically all apartments, condos, but they don't necessarily compete with each other. Price point, bedroom count, building quality, strata history, and location can completely change the negotiating environment. And the July stats show exactly how dramatically that can happen when we zoom into individual neighborhoods. So let's start with Kitsilano, where I live, because this might be the best example in the entire report. Remember, Vancouver West detached overall had a 10% sales ratio. Kitsilano, there were 35 detached houses available and 13 sales. That's a 37% sales ratio. So someone who hears Westside detached is a buyer's market and assumes that automatically applies to a good Kitsilano house priced right could be in for a surprise. On the attached side, which includes condos and townhouses in this particular stats report, Kitsilano had 127 properties available and 26 sales, a 20% ratio. So even within Kitsilano, your negotiating strategy depends heavily on what you're trying to buy. Now, let's move east into Fairview. Fairview is predominantly an attached market, and July was surprisingly active. There were 93 condos and townhouses available and 23 sales. That's a 25% sales ratio, seller's market territory based on the monthly stats indicator. That's an important message for condo buyers. More inventory across Metro Vancouver does not mean you can automatically walk into a desirable Fairview property and expect the seller to take a huge discount. The broader market may be soft, while a specific neighborhood and property type can still be very competitive. Mount Pleasant gives us almost the opposite lesson, depending on what you're buying. On the east side, there were 121 attached properties available and 25 sales in July. That's a 21% sales ratio, putting the neighborhood just into seller's market territory on the monthly indicator. But look at detached houses. There were 14 detached house listings and only one sale. That's roughly a 7% sales ratio. So within the exact same neighborhood, someone buying a detached house could have substantially more leverage than someone competing for an attractive condo or townhouse. That's why property type matters so much. And finally, downtown. This is overwhelmingly a condo market, and there's a lot of choice. Across the downtown report, there were 917 attached properties available and 134 sales, producing a 15% sales ratio, balanced market territory. The median July sale price was approximately $805,000. Properties were selling at about 99% of asking, and average days on market increased to 30 days. But don't read too much into the median falling from 890 in June to 805 in July. That's a change in the mix of properties sold, not every evidence that every downtown condo suddenly lost almost 10% of its value in 1 month. And downtown itself is fragmented. Hull Harbor was at 18% sales ratio. So that means for every 100 listings, 18 sold. Yaletown was at 18%. Downtown proper was 14%. The West End was 11%. Even bedroom count mattered. Studios and one beds were at 16%, two beds 15%, but three bedroom properties were only 8%. So downtown buyers generally have choice, but the amount of leverage changes depending on exactly what they're buying. So let's turn all these numbers into something useful. If you're buying detached, this is generally a market where you can be patient. Look at competing inventory, inspect carefully, and negotiate. But don't assume that applies to every neighborhood. Kitsilano is the obvious example. If you're buying a townhouse, scarcity still matters. A good family-sized townhouse in the right neighborhood can behave very differently from the overall market. If you're buying a condo, get even more specific. Look at neighborhood, bedroom count, building quality, and competing inventory before deciding how aggressive your offer should be. And if you're selling any of these property types, the biggest mistake right now is pricing based on what your neighbors sold for a year or two ago. Buyers have too much information and too many alternatives. In this market, properly positioned homes can still sell very well. Overpriced homes will sit. So what's happening in Vancouver real estate right now? The answer isn't simply that it's a buyer's market or a seller's market. Detached homes are one market, townhouses are another market, condos are another. And then every neighborhood breaks those categories down even further. Kitsilano detached can behave completely different from the west side overall. Fairview attached can favor sellers while downtown is balanced. And Mount Pleasant can simultaneously have a relatively strong attached market and a very slow detached market. So when someone tells you what the Vancouver market is doing, my first question would be, which market? Because right now, that's the question that actually matters. So if you're thinking about buying or selling and want me to break these numbers down for your specific property type and neighborhood, reach out anytime. I would love to chat. Thanks for watching this market update.